This is through council direction to develop policy for electrification for new construction. And Public Works and Planning departments have been researching options, including the use of energy codes to require electric space and water heating for new commercial and large multifamily buildings. So we requested a work session with staff requested a work session with council to present new energy codes adopted in Seattle for potential use in Bellingham. Code and building specialists from the city of Seattle will present at the work session to assess with questions regarding Seattle's new energy code. And with that, I am going to turn this over to our Public Works Director, Eric Johnson.
Thank you, Councilmember Vargas. And we're a little bit behind time, so we will be as succinct and efficient as we can to try to keep us on track. We do have a small presentation by staff. Seth Vidania, Kurt Navafeld, and Sean Ainsley have been working closely on this. So I'm going to turn it quickly over to them, but I just want to recap what the recommendation is for today's conversation. And that's included in the staff report under recommended council action. We're hoping that you'll, as one of a recommendation, it's not the recommendation, there's other things the council certainly can do as you choose, but it's to direct staff to develop an ordinance based on Seattle's code, not copy the code, but based on the code for commercial and large multifamily buildings for electrification, consistent with our climate action plan. So with that, I'll turn it over to Seth, Sean, and Kurt.
Great, thank you, Director Johnston. Are my slides visible on the screen there? Okay, and everyone can hear me. Great. Council, thanks for your time today. During our work session, as the director mentioned, Natural Resources and Planning will be talking with you about our local changes to our local energy code for commercial and large multifamily buildings. These are changes that we could make in order to help reach Bellingham's carbon pollution reduction goals. And today we're joined by subject matter experts from the city of Seattle and King County who helped their respective organizations make significant progress on their energy codes and who have also been assisting the city of Bellingham in our own analysis of how we might apply these codes. As you may know, in February, Seattle passed a suite of changes to their energy code for commercial and large multifamily buildings, and King County is in the latter stages of that process. Our guests today are Dwayne Johnlin, Energy Code and Energy Conservation Advisor for the City of Seattle, Catherine Petrie, Project Program Manager for the Green Building Program in King County, and Nicole Sanders, Principal Planner for the Green Building Program in King County. We're very grateful for their time today and their help over the past several months. For our work session, Natural Resources and Planning will present on these potential energy code changes for about 15 minutes. Seattle staff will talk for about 5 to 10 about the challenges they faced with their own changes, and then we'll move into a Q&A with you for the remainder of our time. And just to say up front, we are in the exploratory stage of research for changes to our energy code and have been reaching out to the local builder community and climate advocates to help inform staff and council as to the impacts of moving forward with this code. And as we progress through our investigation, we expect to continue the conversation with you and the greater community. At some point, we may require the use of outside consultants. We're not there just yet, but we want to leave that option open at this time. So to set the stage for this conversation today, I'd like to first review our carbon pollution reduction targets here. Within the 2018 Climate Action Plan, Council adopted a long-term goal of an 85% reduction in carbon pollution by 2050 from a baseline that was established in the year 2000. After 2000, the city completed inventories every 5 years, and what we see between 2000 and 2015 was about a 10% drop in carbon pollution. Between 2015 and 2050, we'll need to see another 75% drop in carbon pollution. And I'll add that from just recently, President Biden created some goals nationally, and our interim goal for 2030 now lags that federal commitment by 10%. So however you look at it, there's a lot to do and not very much time, which really begged the question that came up last February when we were starting the climate policy vetting process, which is, which actions will reduce emissions the fastest and provide the greatest benefit to the community. And one of the top 10 items that came out of that process was electrification of new buildings. And this next slide will show you a little as to why we chose to focus there. Nationally, buildings account for 40% of energy use in the US, and the greenhouse gas pollution that comes along with that. Here in Bellingham, we're very near that average, with 43% of community emissions coming from our residential and commercial buildings. And we'll take a look at that breakdown of the 43%. Residential and commercial buildings roughly split all of the emissions in their sector, with the majority of emissions coming from the electricity that those buildings consume and the rest from natural gas combustion. And though natural gas is the smaller portion of this pie, these two power sources are very different in terms of the future of each fuel. Through the Clean Energy Transformation Act, our electrical grid is projected to decrease carbon intensity by 80% by 2030, whereas CETA, that act does not cover natural gas. And while we've heard about renewable natural gas and offsets, and those may be able to drop emissions somewhat, renewable natural gas is in really short supply right now, and offsets come with a number of questions as to their efficacy. So given the projected future of natural gas, requiring that all new buildings be built all electric where is feasible, will reduce the need to convert future building stock to be all electric. Every new building that we build with gas technology represents both a city-sanctioned long-term carbon emission source, as well as a potential financial risk. And to be really clear, the codes that we're talking about today would not affect residential buildings per state law. That building stock would have to be approached through a different mechanism. Today, we're focusing on electrification of commercial and large multifamily buildings. And there's a number of different ways that municipalities can take on this issue. These options include using city authority to regulate health and welfare, local zoning codes, advocating for state level action that would then roll down our way, passing policy for just city-owned buildings if we wanted to look at municipal buildings only, and then finally changes to local building or energy codes, as we're talking about today. And a number of cities have done this. In California, 36 local governments have passed some type of all electric building requirement or incentive. Burlington, Vermont, voters recently passed a ballot measure that gives the city the authority to regulate heating sources in homes and businesses, and that's being looked at by the state for legal approval at this point. New York it has mentioned a gas ban by 2030, and then we see our friends in Seattle with an all-electric construction code for commercial large multifamily. So we wouldn't be the first to do this, but we would be really wise to consider all of the impacts of moving forward in this fashion, including on affordability, as well as the health and safety of building occupants. So our hope is that through this conversation and others that we'll be having, we'll be able to provide you with the information that you need along the way. With that intro, I'll pass it off to Kurt Nabafeld to talk about the codes.
Good afternoon, Council. Kurt Nabafeld, Planning and Community Development Department. Building codes are generally the most technical regulations that we work with. So today we're going to try to explain some of these code changes, but from a high level. But first we felt we wanted to make sure that everyone had a bit of background on how building codes are actually developed. So national model codes are incrementally updated every 3 years. These model codes include the International Building Code, the International Residential Code, as well as plumbing, mechanical, electrical, and energy model codes. Once adopted at the national level, the states are then required to review these, amend these based on regional conditions, as well as state legislative mandates. One example of that is our state currently requires a 70% net annual reduction in building energy consumption by 2031. This is one of the reasons why Washington is known to have a very progressive energy code. We're actually one of the nation's leaders. Those Washington codes became effective February 1st of 2021. Once the Washington state codes are adopted, the local jurisdictions are required to adopt and implement those codes. Bellingham has done that. We did that earlier this year, and currently we're working on a 2018 building code, which are in effect as of February 1st of this year. We are allowed to amend certain codes, such as the commercial code or the IBC. Bellingham and other states are not allowed to amend the International Residential Energy or building codes. So to get into a little bit of the technical, I'm now going to turn it over to your building official, Sean Angeli, who will walk through kind of the specific components of this code proposal. Next slide.
Good morning, Council. I'm Sean Angeli, the Bellingham's code official, and I'd like to describe to you the general approach or the focuses on the three components of Seattle's electric code. The first one is electrification. We have efficiency, and then finally solar ready. These apply, again, as Kurt described, to multifamily residential and commercial buildings, and the solar ready aspect does apply to residential. I'll discuss that further when we get to that component. The guiding principles are to firstly build great envelopes, the best we can build. They'll be there for the life of the building. Secondly, eliminate combustion, reduce and restrict fossil fuels. Thirdly, use electricity wisely. Don't utilize electric resistant heat and choose better use of electrical systems. And lastly, generate power. With solar readiness, this is the only module that pertains to, again, both commercial and residentials. I'd like to start off explaining the first component, and that would be electrification. The electrification aspect will prohibit the use of natural gas used for water heating and space heating in commercial and multifamily buildings. Occupancies like hotels and apartment buildings require large volume use of both of these elements. This means that heat pump type water heaters will be needed in lieu of traditional, less efficient water heating equipment. The water heating element has a delayed implementation date in order to ensure the equipment availability. The demand for the equipment should push the manufacturing process and be readily available for this future implementation date. The space heating element, which again cannot use fossil fuels or electric resistant heats, will need to rely on alternative sources such as heat pumps with these applications. Lastly, this also requires that electrical infrastructure, such as receptacles or outlets, be provided in major appliance locations. Appliances like ovens, ranges, and dryers will still be allowed to utilize gas, but having these provisions will facilitate the future conversion to electricity down the road. The second module is efficiency. This addresses building assemblies, such as walls, floors, roofs, and other elements which create the thermal envelope. These building elements are required to be 10% more efficient with respect to air leakage and their thermal transmission properties. One of the three paths used when designing a building for compliance has an energy modeling component to it. When choosing this method, the efficiency increase does not support substandard design envelope designs. When using the total building performance code path, not only does the building envelope need to be more efficient, but also the building systems, such as the mechanical ventilation and the lighting systems. Finally, the efficiency aspect requires additional energy credits to be gained, as well as penalizing gas equipment when trying to claim these as energy credits. The final component would be the solar ready provisions. They have been adopted, by Bellingham through state amendments and applies only to commercial buildings 20 stories or less. What this means is that a portion of the roof will be designed and dedicated for the solar installation. This also includes the electrical system to provide the necessary space for the conversion of the system and allow for the future photovoltaic arrays. The options for sizing the solar systems is designating 40% of the building roof area or providing sufficient area to afford the generation of 20% of the peak electrical load. Seattle successfully adopted this in Appendix 4 Residential Building Code with the State Building Code Council's approval, and now the solar ready provisions not only apply to commercial but residential as well. All new 1 and 2 family dwellings will need 300 square feet of solar ready space, and multifamily like townhomes and duplexes will need to designate 150 square feet of roof area. The solar ready provisions contain affordable housing options and exemptions that are peppered throughout that section, so I'm not going to go into detail about that. currently, as we still need to do some research on our part. But that completes the provisions, and I actually forgot to say forward the slides. So Seth, I apologize for that. And council, if you were wondering where I was at on those, that was the end of the solar ready slide.
Great, thanks, Sean. As we've been meeting with stakeholders from our community, including both the building community, real estate agencies, climate activists, and energy experts, Seth, can you move on to the next slide? Yeah, thank you. I think, as I mentioned, we've been working with these groups, and there's been a lot of issues that have come up in our meetings, and these are things that we need to continue to focus on and to consider when making decisions on this code change. The number one comment that has been come up, throughout all of our discussions is affordability. Obviously, any change that we make to require something more than what the standard codes already require will increase costs. There are some savings that will be found as we continue to ramp up, as the industry ramps up. You're also, there's a blend of, what one standard requires to implement, such as gas infrastructure, will no longer be needed. So you're going to save a little bit there, but you're also going to increase on some of these other things. So we want to be very clear is that there is an impact to affordability on these individual units, and it's something that council needs to consider. We've also had one of the main reasons that we find it beneficial to move forward at this time, not only because our policies direct us to do that, but also because what our surrounding jurisdictions are doing, such as Seattle and King County. Right now, there's a lot of staff and industry training that these agencies are putting on, and we think it would be very beneficial for our city staff and our local development community to be able to engage in these trainings that are happening down south. Since they're all being conducted virtually, I think it's a great opportunity for us to move forward on that. We also understand that there's a difference in scale and buildings between Seattle and King County and what we're seeing in Bellingham. Just now, Bellingham is starting to see much larger buildings, and I think that's what we're going to continue to see. So some of the studies that have been done on costs associated with this, there's a difference in scale, and we need to make sure that we're evaluating that in those cost analysis. One of the ways that the national codes and generally our building codes deal with technology advances and efficiency standards is through these incremental every 3 years. However, we believe that due to our local and state mandates, we're going to have to take larger steps instead of these smaller incremental steps. And that's why you're seeing the proposals that you're seeing today. One of the reasons, or one of the things that come up when you're talking about implementing new regulations is, can we try to do it incentive-based versus a mandate? We believe that at this point in time, and again, based on our policies and directives, we need to look at a mandate versus an incentive base. We believe that this is a prudent path and one that our policies and goals support. We need to be adaptive, and this will be an iterative process, but it is a step forward. And at the end of today, we'd like council to provide direction and recommend we continue to move forward with our outreach and drafting changes to implement these codes. This is not an easy decision that we understand council is going to have to make, but we do believe that there are policies behind it, and we do believe that it's the right step at the time. With that, I'm going to turn it now over to Dwayne, Kathleen, and Nicole to talk about a little bit of their experiences in implementing the codes, very similar to what we're proposing. So thank you.
Thank you. And thanks to the council for having us. I was asked to say a few things about challenges we've encountered in implementing our new energy code here. I can say from experience that imposing new regulations of any kind doesn't do a lot for your popularity ratings, but it's usually necessary when you have goals you have to achieve. And it's pretty standard human reaction when confronted with a change of any kind to focus on the worst possible outcomes. So when some of the complaints you hear might be just grandstanding by industries trying to whip up opposition, but others are coming from people who are genuinely worried about the impact of these new policies. with the new Seattle Code development, we provided lots of outreach and education and plenty of time for Q&A. This wasn't just the formal public hearings, but also we did technical webinars. We've provided online design resources. We've had guest appearances at dozens of engineering societies and trade associations, housing providers, all sorts. Just parenthetically, I'd like all the Bellingham versions of those organizations to know that we can provide the same education and training up where you are. Given that we're all meeting online anyway, it's not going to be any problem, and we'd be happy to do it. Another issue is providing some time for everyone to adjust when we're introducing new technology. So for a couple of these new provisions, we wrote in delayed implementation dates to give design teams extra time to get up to speed. For instance, projects applying for permits before the end of this year won't have to provide heat pump water heaters. Even projects that apply early next year won't be installing those water heating systems for a year or two. So suppliers and contractors have even more time to prepare and tool up. I just wanted to mention, based on comments you just heard from your staff, that heat pump technology is so efficient that it is reducing electrical use dramatically from what projects would have been doing heating or water heating with electric resistance, which is quite typical. And that balances out any increases in electrical use that when we're going from gas to heat pump. Finally, I wanted to say that it makes some sense perhaps to circle back now and then to the impact of doing nothing. Under the do nothing option, progress towards your environmental goals is really slow, and the same health and safety impacts of gas infrastructure just continue on in your community. So it might feel like a small thing for Bellingham to be doing this on its own, but nothing big ever happens until somebody steps out and takes the lead. And so this is what's giving other communities the confidence to move forward themselves. You never know how far the ripples of your actions here today will extend based on your leadership. I think I'd like to pass this on to Nicole.
Thanks, Dwayne. So I'm Nicole Sanders. I work with King County on our implementation of these codes. We followed a similar process as it sounds like Bellingham might be considering, where we've taken a look at the Seattle codes, and we underwent a evaluation process to see, which codes we thought best fit our circumstances, and also did some assessments of how we thought it might impact staff to review some of the additional provisions. One of the things I think that's come out of this process of looking at the Seattle codes is that emphasis on the natural gas. We like the efficiency and we like the solar and solar ready provisions, but really it's the natural gas provisions that will be continuing greenhouse gas emitters. And I also think it's an opportunity for some education, both internally amongst the staff as well as externally among the public. Natural gas has a sort of nostalgic aura to it, where we have associations with these warm flames on the stovetop. And we've been trying to provide outreach in a lot of our public meetings, to kind of disclose some of the indoor air pollution impacts and potential links to asthma, especially among youth. And also kind of, evaluate some of the public safety risks where we've actually had explosions. There's some interesting pictures where there was some underground gas leaks that actually caught fire in the CD district, and you can actually see like flames coming up through the sidewalk. So it's been interesting sort of going to staff and kind of beginning some of that process. So that's something that we've been working through, is kind of getting our staff on board and educated and trying to provide that education to the public. We have looked at impacts to housing as well, in terms of, whether we thought this would be a barrier in terms of increasing affordable housing costs. The codes only apply for housing projects that are 4 stories and taller. So that actually reduced the, I'd say, diameter of concern around the housing impacts, just because we have a lot of multifamily that's 3 stories and taller. And then, as we went through the cost projections, we saw that, there is kind of minimal costs per dwelling unit for 4 stories and taller. It's like $1,000 a dwelling unit when you have $250,000, $350,000 per development, per dwelling unit for development costs. So that's also something that we looked through. We are kind of wanting to pursue a lot of these codes right now as well, because we foresee that these codes will likely increasingly be incorporated in state codes. We see that as an opportunity to get our staff trained and teed up and begin providing training opportunities for contractors in our area where these are things that are increasingly going to be coming about. So we want people to start getting familiar with them now, preferably. And yeah, I guess the last thing that, just kind of circling back to the natural gas side of things, I've done some research, and I think between 1987 and 2019, Washington state residential gas connections went from 400,000 to 1.2 million. We added almost as much gas as we added houses in that period. So there's been an explosion, forgive the phrase, but an explosion of natural gas, I think, in our state. In a long time, we were pushing for that because it was only half as bad as coal, and half as bad as coal isn't really good enough anymore, unfortunately. So there's still going to be lots of opportunities for natural gas labor groups to continue working, but every gas connection pipe that we put in the ground is sort of it's making the hole in the boat bigger as we're sinking. And so what we're trying to do is slow the rate of making that hole in the boat bigger. So that's kind of been our perception and our experience as we've been approaching integrating these codes ourselves. And then I think the last person we're going to hand it off to is Kathleen Petrie, who's been doing a lot of our outreach in the cities. You're muted, Kathleen.
Thank you. I was so excited I got the video going this time. But yes, my name is Kathleen Petrie, and thank you so much to Council and Bellingham staff for the invitation for us to come join you today. And just to build on top of what Dwayne and Nicole have been sharing, my role is a facilitator of a group called the Regional Code Collaboration, and it has been around for several years, and it's jurisdictions working together to share resources, technical knowledge, experience, tools that can be shared so that we're not all creating the same thing. It's a networking opportunity, and much of that work is in code development associated with green building. So we are very excited to have Bellingham in as a partner. The RCC expands beyond King County. We invite jurisdictions from all over. We've worked with folks from BC down to Portland. And so having this opportunity to promote these codes that are so integral for the path that buildings need to take. Jurisdictions involved in the RCC with respect to consideration of adopting these amendments, there's a tremendous amount of interest. It's probably one of the biggest volumes of folks we've had on Zoom calls in these discussions. But just like Bellingham is, it's grappling with how do we do that? And so wanting to provide that information or become that central location that you can reach to is the Regional Code Collaboration, where we can continue these discussions en masse, and just want to make you aware that that tool is there. But Seattle is a fantastic resource because they have the capacity to do the research and conduct these stakeholder meetings. Dwayne did a tremendous amount of work, and Nicole has continued to build on that. There's a lot of information that exists that we will continue to disseminate to jurisdictions. And there are the jurisdictions that are most interested in this are those that have populations of 60 to 80,000 folks. So it's not just the big players that are having the ability to move forward. It's what can we do? And so do you adopt that package in its entirety? Do you adopt the decarbonizing components? Do you adopt, or do you roll it out slowly, little bits and pieces, as Seattle is doing to help build in those skill sets and the resources available, and these not skill sets just within the jurisdiction, but those outside that are implementing and installing these systems. So we have some excitement as to how we can proceed forward and kind of be ahead of the state so that we are ready when it does become mandate. And so again, thank you very much for the consideration of this, and please continue to reach out to any one of us as you continue on your path of exploration.
Great. Thank you, Kathleen, Nicole, and Dwayne. We really appreciate your help and your time here today. You're a great resource to our work. We'll transition now to our question and answer session with you, Council.
Thank you so much for that. Dwayne, Nicole, Kathleen, really appreciate you sharing with us. One of the things you touched on is resources. And we don't have a lot of resources and everybody kind of pulls together. So it's nice for you to be able to share those things with us today. I'm going to turn this over to our committee right now to start with some questions. Michael, Councilmember Lillquist. And then Hamill.
Thank you for the excellent presentation. This has been a long time in contemplation and coming, and I appreciate the careful approach of the staff reaching out to other jurisdictions. I believe the request is whether or not to continue forward to develop a local ordinance along the lines of the Seattle and King County model. I would be supportive of giving that direction. But I'd like to ask, are there any deviations or changes or differences we're considering here in a local ordinance compared to, say, Seattle? For example, applying to 4 or more story tall buildings, they're a rarity here. Might we consider it applying differently? And also, what is our thinking or current staff thinking on the timing and rollout? Are we going to try to take the bandage off relatively quickly in a year or two, or allow a much longer time? This is new construction, and most people, I think, who are contemplating new construction are very much aware of this fact. I don't think they need years of warning on this. So I'm looking for maybe a faster approach. But what is staff's thinking on rollout timing in any ordinance and any changes and differences compared to how it's been done elsewhere?
I think I'll start with that one. The changes, we continue to evaluate some, and Sean may be able to elaborate a little bit more on this, but one of the key things that we are seeing, I think, is just the level of development. And you mentioned that, whether or not it can apply to smaller stories and multifamily buildings. Unfortunately, the International Residential Code and the International Building Code, those are the two different codes that we can amend the building code, the International Building Code, which applies to those 4 stories and larger buildings. So one of the things that we are seeing, though, in Bellingham is more and more larger buildings, larger multifamily buildings. They're the ones that seem to be, one, meeting the need, and 2, they seem to be able to be financed a lot more in those numbers, and that's more than those 4 units. Secondly, timeline. Well, as Councilmember Vargas mentioned, resources. Resources are a very challenging thing right now, especially when it comes to the Planning and Community Development Department. Right now, we're inundated with, we continue to see a large number of building permits and land use permits. And so the question is, the same people that are reviewing these, where we've got our plans examiners and Sean, who are, trying to review plans to get them out so that we can keep construction moving, are the ones that will also probably be tasked with a lot of writing this code changes. Obviously, we can look to King County and Seattle, and it makes it a little bit easier, but there's still time that will take care of that. So this is something that we believe is going to take us a little bit longer. We do believe that a kind of a phased implementation is more important for all the reasons that Dwayne and Nicole mentioned, is that you allow for your staff as well as the local industry to kind of come up to speed, whether instead of just trying to turn the switch right away. So I think that we're going to continue to, if we get council's blessing today, we'll continue to keep this as a priority, but we do need to balance that in the terms of our other workload, especially getting permits out the door so we can continue the construction work. Sean, I don't know if you've got any more specifics that you'd like to mention when it comes to the details.
Yeah, I would just like to say that Councilmember Lindquist, it's not going to be a blanket adoption of Seattle to Bellingham. There's some intricacies and some technical aspects that just don't apply to us. So it would have to be some revisions made for sure going through the code. The rollout time, like Kurt said, resources are key in doing that. And just to reiterate, we're pretty busy with what we're doing currently, and to take on this, it might be more beneficial to look towards a certain aspect of the three main parts of the puzzle. Other than that, yeah, I don't have any more advice. But other than, yeah, I think there's going to be some resources need to be placed on it.
Dwayne, I see you have your hand up as well. Did you have something you wanted to add to that?
Yes, just a clarification for Councilmember Lillquist that it's 4 stories and up for multifamily, but for all other commercial, it's any height building.
Councilmember Hamel?
Thanks for the presentation. Really good presentation here today. So like Seattle, Bellingham has an affordable housing levy, and I'm wondering if our friends from Seattle could provide us any advice or direction on how, or if there are any exemptions for those affordable housing developers. Ms. Sanders mentioned that it was about $1,000 per unit. I just want to see if there's any exemption for affordable housing developers.
The one exemption that we did put in there was to say that affordable housing does not need to provide solar on the roof. But as a companion to that, we said that other projects that are required to put the solar on the roof but don't want to are able instead to gift that system to an affordable housing project. We hope that that would be a match made in heaven. As far as cost, the cost for space heating is probably zero for the dwelling units themselves, because we have an exemption that lets a certain amount of electric resistance heating per room for apartments. The idea being that having a really tiny heat pump doesn't really necessarily pay for itself. And for heat pump water heating, a central system using the latest CO2 refrigerant technology, it's actually pretty terrific. Looks like it was going to be something on $700 or $800 per unit additional cost beyond what a typical water heating system would have been. Some other minor expenses for better windows. That's pretty much it for affordable housing, and we've certainly been through this with our affordable housing providers in great detail for the last 2 years, and have come to pretty good agreement here. If any of your affordable housing providers would like to connect with ours to discuss this, on a peer basis, please let us know.
Councilmember Lillquist, I see your hand up, but also Council President Stone, did you have a question, or are you just reminding us of the time?
No, I have questions when Councilmember Lillquist is done. Okay,
all right. I'm going to actually just take a turn first. First of all, I am very much in support of electrification. We all know that building use is our highest use of energy, and focusing on commercial building, I think, is a great place for us to start and to show that it works and that the equipment is there and the resources are there. So I totally support that. I also like that we are very much focusing on improving our energy efficiency, because energy efficiency is a #1 step to conservation. And I know solar gets us there and all of those other things, but if we don't focus on conservation, we don't actually make impacts. We have bad building envelopes, we have bad insulation, all of those things. So really like that we're putting a strong emphasis on having higher energy efficiency codes in our city. I think that it does show leadership. So thank you for looking at those things and for your leadership on that. Curious about one thing. I encourage us and want us to absolutely transition as much as we can to renewable energy. What I'm curious about is in the solar codes, some of these are also talking about residential, and we are talking about commercial. So I'm curious in regards to solar ready. We are just focusing on commercial buildings, but what if have you done exemptions, et cetera, if places are not appropriate for solar energy? Because not everything is appropriate to put solar panels on. So I'm kind of curious how you handled the solar ready portion.
Councilmember Vargas, is this a question for feasibility of getting solar panels on residential buildings?
I'm sorry, I should have been more clear in my question. My question is partly for the city of Seattle, how they handled issues for solar ready that are not in the most appropriate location for solar. And I guess second part of that is how the city of Bellingham wants to incorporate that.
So I could take the first part. There is an exemption in there, I believe, for extensively shaded rooftops, where obviously it doesn't make sense. The other thing to consider is that the solar readiness for a residential building or even a commercial building is very close to a zero cost thing. It just means that you have to do some planning in advance. It's a dotted line on the roof plan that says this is where it will go, and there's no junk in the way. So it's making it much cheaper in the future when the costs have come so low that everybody wants to put in the solar, but it doesn't really cost anything up front beyond a little time to think it over.
And just to elaborate on that, I would say when it's 75% shaded, you can provide solar studies that deems the roof will not facilitate the installation of solar arrays. That, and there's some language in there that also talks about the configuration of the rooftop equipment needing, if it's such that it does not afford the space for the solar arrays, then the building official can grant exemptions to the solar requirements.
Thank you. Councilmember Lillquist, then Stone.
Yeah, first of all, I really appreciate the idea of solar readiness. As you say, it's very cheap if you look ahead of time, and as opposed to walk out to a site and go, what do we do about that? With regard to efficiency, very simple question. I agree. The logic for efficiency is impeccable, I think. If you make a building very efficient, then you can use smaller technologies to fully meet your needs, right? Make the problem smaller and then solve it. So this is how you make the problem smaller. What I saw is the bullet point said 10% more efficient. More efficient than what? What is the baseline that is 10% more efficient than?
I would say that I see you've unmuted yourself, Dwayne, but that's the current 2018 energy code. Seattle's code is approximately 10% more efficient than current code.
So it's compared with the state.
Okay, so funny thing about percentages, I mean, you're going closer to zero, is 10% is smaller and smaller each time you add 10%. Quantitatively, I mean, like how small are we actually making the problem?
I'm just going to jump in. So for lighting power and for window insulation values, or R values, the way those are evaluated by the state is they have these long list of tables, and they say for this type of space, you have this much lighting power density, and for this kind of space for your. And so basically what Seattle did was they went through each of those codes for lighting power density, and they made each one of those 10% better or more efficient across the line. So it's a per space type adjustment mathematically to the values that are in there by 10% per value.
Councilmember Stone.
Thank you. So just briefly, I have one comment, I guess, and one question. So one is related to, well, I guess maybe two comments quickly. One is with respect to the comments that are made about energy efficiency, and certainly we see it in different ways when we're discussing climate action and sort of the old adage, you know, reduce, reuse, and recycle. And we focus a lot on, I think, the far end of recycling, and really needing to go back now to the focus a lot more on the reduce and how do we increase that energy efficiency. So just chiming in that, yes, 100%. Second comment was related to Councilmember Hamel and the concern for affordable housing, right, and the use of our home fund, and wanting to make sure that, you know, things aren't going to be cost burden, especially on individuals who may be low income, and having that trickle down. But I guess to our staff and going forward and thinking about exemptions, I guess one of my concerns is if we look at exemptions, I see that as it not applying, right, and that these would not be applicable in that case. But in thinking about the health benefits as well as the climate impact, wanting to make sure that we're looking at subsidies and different ways of how do we make this come to fruition without it being cost burdensome. So just a clarification, I guess, about how I look at exemptions versus how do we bring it to fruition without that cost burden. And then the question, I guess, is for staff with respect to moving forward, wanting, obviously, in an ideal world, for us to be able to snap our fingers and to move forward much more quickly. I just had a question about the budget piece. So I know that there was some funding that was placed specifically for climate action, and I believe that that money was to be earmarked perhaps for leveraging this workload, looking at additional contracting or support services. And so I'm just wondering if that's something we're looking at now to alleviate that workload burden that Kurt Nabfeld, you know, referenced, or what we can do to help move that work forward.
Renee, can you address that question, please?
Sure, happy to. Renee LaCroix, Public Works. I think it remains to be seen. The money could be used for that, but I think we want to see what direction we want to go and what level of effort we're looking at. So it's definitely a possibility, but I think we need a bit more information.
Ms. Snell, there's also an element of when these types of codes are implemented by staff, it's critically important that the staff be heavily involved with that. So the combination between the planning department staff, the legal department staff, and to the extent that we can help from the outside, and that's probably the bigger challenge. A consultant could write it, but then we have to implement it. And Rick may have something to add to that as well.
Well, we hear from council that this is a priority. If you give us direction today, we'll work on a scheme to implement it, and we'll balance the workload we have, the resources we have to do it in the quickest manner possible. But clearly the ball's in your court now to give us direction on this. And when we receive that, we'll roll up our sleeves, work together, and figure out the best path forward to do it in the most timely basis.
Thank you, Director Sepler. Dwayne, did you have a comment that you wanted to add? I see your hand up.
Just to respond to Councilmember Stone, that yes, there's a small increment additional cost for affordable housing for construction, but there's also a very long-term impact on their utility costs. And those that's a huge burden on all affordable housing organizations is water, light, and heat. And so reducing those is going to impact and benefit the long-term economic health of those organizations.
Thank you. Okay, so just a couple of comments. One is that in regards to recommendations, I'm going to look to my other committee members, but I believe we all think that this should probably go forward. And so I'll look for a motion on that, or if you just want direction. But the other thing is one of the things that we mentioned here is staying in relationship with our building community, with our union workers, in also consideration that as we do transition, that this affects jobs, and how we are staying in relationship with our organizations to ensure that we're having open communication about transitioning together. I think that's really important. And in regards to keeping our costs low, you know, part of the gas explosion was the fact gas has been way, way cheaper for many, many years. And in some places, efficiency was higher. Now that's not so much. But that we have to keep in mind in regards to our costs and how we're doing it. You mentioned solar and maybe leaving out low income. I don't agree with that. I think that low income housing, affordable housing, yes, maybe the costs are a little bit higher to put solar panels on in the beginning, but the long-term savings are huge and certainly way better for people if they don't have to pay a huge electricity bill every month. So I'm hoping that that's something that we can retain and we find maybe as subsidies or another way to do it to make sure that we are building affordable housing and that renewable energy is always part of the equation. So in regards to direction, is there some specifics that you would like to see, or Councilmember Lillquist and Councilmember Hamel?
I'm just going to move that we direct staff to continue along the same lines to develop an ordinance to meet the 3 goals of electrification, improved efficiency, and solar readiness in commercial buildings and large multifamily. And also, of course, incorporate the sort of the character of the comments from council members in their further work.
I have a motion in front of us. Councilmember Hamel, comments?
Oh, I was just a little slow on the draw there, Councilmember Lillquist. Pardon me. I was able to articulate what I was thinking in terms of direction.
All right, we have a motion in front of us to support staff to continue on the path with these 3 Met recommendations and come back to us at soonest timeline. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries 3-0. I'm going to recommend that this evening's council meeting. Thanks again so much from everyone from Seattle for all your information and for the support. We really appreciate this. We know that leadership takes collaboration, and we thank you for working with our teams. And to our staff, thank you very much for all the efforts you put into this. And with that, end of committee, and I'm going to turn it over to Councilmember Stone, or should I just adjourn, Council President?
No, that sounds great. Thank you, Councilmember Vargas. We will reconvene at 1 o'clock for our special meeting, which is a closed record hearing, and then continue with committee of the whole. But for now, thank you to our guests from Seattle. We look forward to the partnership continuing. Greatly appreciate the opportunity to collaborate. And we are adjourned until 1 o'clock. Thank you.